I'm Christian. I'm the founder and CEO of a business called Paddle. I'm joined by Marcus. And Marcus and I kind of do the same thing as each other, but have taken a very different approach to how we've built our businesses. So Paddle has been going for about the same amount of time, about kind of 9 years. We've raised $100 million in funding. We're very much focused on one problem in the world of how do we make it easier for software companies to sell their software. Whereas Marcus's journey is slightly different. Marcus runs a venture studio called Harbour. And I guess I'd be interested in just understanding, one, what is a venture studio? Like, what is that?
Yeah, so venture studio, so we build a new software company every year. Been going for 9 years. And I guess all venture studios are primarily trying to systematically build startups and figure out like what is the process for not just building a startup, but then turning it into scale up. So we're sort of very much trying to focus on how do we, systemize that whole process.
How many startups have you created over the
9.
9 startups? How do you decide? Like, for me, like my journey was experienced a problem, tried to create a solution for it, have been still trying to create the solution for it for the last 9 years. How do you decide what to build and when to build it and what's a good idea or when?
So we've taken a few different approaches to this over the years, and we've desperately tried to turn this into a process where we can come up with a list of ideas and come up with a magic formula to work out which ones to pick. And in a way, the more that we've tried to turn that into a system, the worse it's got. So I think actually it's something where we've come to realize that actually solving our own problems, that our best ventures came out of solving a problem we experienced with the previous venture. And I think so much for why that's the case is that in a way, like the idea is important, but not as important as how it's executed. So we've kind of dialed back a little bit over time on trying to kind of find the perfect idea, and sort of tried to focus a bit more on how do we execute it as best as possible.
It's really interesting. I think one of the things when we were chatting at kind of dinner the other night, we were talking about this idea of like product market fit and finding product market fit being this sort of, there's kind of like 2 stages to a company. It's like the product market fit, find product market fit, and figure out how to scale that thing. And I think one of the things that kind of struck me was certainly in like our journey of building Paddle, that kind of getting to product market fit stage was definitely like a 1-2+ year endeavor that was brutally painful. So I guess I'm interested in like how you've created a business out of basically getting stuff to product market fit. Like, how do you do that? And also like why subject yourself to the misery of like doing that once a year?
Yeah, I guess because I didn't learn my lesson. No, it's. I think what's interesting is it doesn't get easier. Like having done this nine times, and granted, not every one of those got to product market fit, but each time it's the thing that goes wrong is different, and I think this is because to get a product to product market fit, you've got like 3 moving pieces, right? You've got the market, you've got the actual product, and then you've got the kind of glue between them, which is the messaging. And you can't change one of those without affecting the other 2. And so we're always trying to kind of work out like how do you kind of, what's the right order to focus on those? And typically it's kind of the product is the first thing that you build with some validation that around the messaging. Then we've sort of tried to focus on the market, and then the messaging kind of connects the 2. So it's something that we try to kind of work out, like how do we short circuit getting to product market fit as quickly as possible, but it's just hard. Like as much as we've tried to figure that out, we still struggle. Like it's really difficult.
Yeah, I definitely didn't think about it as quite scientifically when we were going through it. I think we had an idea of a thing that we wanted to build. who started building the thing. And then it was a process of, like, I think, throwing a lot of stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. I guess if you haven't, so you didn't want to systematize how you get to an idea, but I guess, are you systematizing kind of how you get to product market fit? Or like, what are the things that are similar, but I think I'm far more interested in, like, what are the things that are different? Like, what are the things that are surprising in I guess, across those three buckets?
So I think one thing we've definitely learned that is similar is on the market piece. So I guess like when you build a product, the product is a relatively fixed thing. Like you can change it, of course, by developing features, etc. But generally, it's the most fixed of those three parts. So the two bits that you can really play with early on are who are we building this for, and how are we describing this? Like, what's the messaging around it? And so those are the two bits that we try to work out. Okay, how do you? Because we build a new one every year, so it's our window to figure this stuff out is tiny. So we're trying to figure out how do you work out who the right market is for a product in days or weeks. And there's lots of tools that we've come across that really help with that. Years ago, that would take us months to figure that out. Now we can sort of get directional correctness in a matter of weeks. But yeah, it's a bit of a...
I think it's challenging, like, however you look at it. But I guess through that, do you ever feel like, kind of through this process of kind of like industrializing the creation of a startup, do you ever feel like, I guess, because of that model, you potentially like squander opportunity of like maybe the thing that took 3 months to get to product market fit or didn't get to there at all? Like, I think I'm definitely, like, if we'd done that at Paddle, like if we'd stopped after a year, we wouldn't have had product market fit. We wouldn't be a sort of 50 million kind of like revenue business today. Like if we had stopped after 12 months, like how do you think about that? Like how do you reconcile the like value that you potentially leave on the table by not giving up, but like kind of moving on to the next thing?
So we looked at the data around this recently because I was convinced that we had got our ventures to kind of product market fit in about a year or less than a year, and it turns out my recollection of how long it took to get to that point was way off. So I think on average across the 9 ventures, I think it took us just over 2 years to get a venture to product market fit. But what was really interesting about when we looked at this data was that the first 18 months of any startup we'd created was an awful predictor of its future success or failure. So if we looked across like any sort of metric, whether it's traffic, whether it's net promoter score, revenue, anything like that, you could not tell at 18 months whether it was going to do that or whether it was going to do that. It was in that kind of the next 12 months afterwards where either something clicked or it just didn't.
Died, yeah.
And that's interesting because I often see like a lot of these things, people sort of saying like you should know whether the startup's going to work in 6 months or 12 months, and it just hasn't been our experience. I'm curious, like at what point with Paddle did you realize like, okay, this thing is going to take off?
I'll let you know. No, no, it was probably. I think this is interesting. This was going to be like a follow-up to that. I think that this idea of finding product market fit is almost like a category error. It's almost like a misdirect, because I feel like every 3 years as a business, as we grow and scale in different markets, different types of customer and things like that, I feel like we're in this constant evolution and process of trying to find either product market fit or better product market fit or sort of something fit with a different type of customer or a different kind of vertical that we try and work to, or a different size of customer. So I think that's my thing. There was definitely a point probably 2 years in, roughly, where it was like, I feel pretty good that we're not going out of business like in 3 months' time type of thing. Yeah. But I think even today, there's definitely like parts of like the paddle business today where we are still in like early innings of like we have a core kind of business or set of customers or whatever that really work and that we really understand. And there's definitely portions and pockets of the business where we're like kind of, I have no idea if this thing's going to work, but sort of we have to kind of go through the motions of testing and experimenting.
I guess even in a relatively mature software company, every feature you launch, or as you say, when you're expanding to different markets, you've got this almost like product market fit for each feature, each kind of portion of the market that you're going after. I completely agree. Like I think where we have got to product market fit, you can always be better. You can always find better messaging or a better category of the audience that's going to work better. So it's not really, it's not an event. It's kind of a just continuous process of how do we improve this over time.
I was thinking about like the topic of this, like VC backed versus bootstrapped, and I think and it kind of related to this sort of product market fit thing. I think is like one of focus. I think having investors and raising money and being in a position where we have to very clearly articulate what it is that we're going to go and do or what the vision is, and then sort of go and kind of obviously raise money from people to go and execute on that plan. It sort of forces a degree of focus on us and a level of discipline externally from a board, from investors, from people that we have to work with, where sort of even when we don't feel like kind of persevering with something because it gets really, really difficult, there is sort of this accountability for us to go and have to do it. Like, I guess, like the obvious difference between being VC backed and bootstrapped is like one of them you have more money in order to go and execute on these things, and sort of I think the way that you need to build the business is slightly different. But like aside from that, how do you think about that kind of idea of focus if you're creating one new business a year, where it's imposed on us? Sort of, there's still some self-discipline in there, but it's imposed on us. But you really have to make those decisions about focus. How do you think about that?
I think we have a similar thing happen, but I think it occurs maybe kind of 6 to 8 months later, and it's instead of investors forcing that, it becomes customers, because you think about the sort of underlying philosophy of being bootstrapped is that you have to make profit, and you can only hit profitability if you are able to acquire lots of customers. That has to happen pretty early on, and so customers put the pressure on figuring out product market fit quite early, because if we don't get product market fit, then no one's going to buy it and we don't have revenue to sustain it. So it's similar, but I think within, I guess, the VC approach, it's happening a lot earlier. And I don't think it would be a terrible thing being bootstrapped to almost like simulate that artificially and, put those pitch decks together and figure out, like, almost imagine you have investors. Because it is something like with us, like we sometimes get a bit lazy and very distracted early on with the product. And then 6 months later, you're like, okay, we need to sell this now. And that becomes, tricky.
It's a tricky balance to kind of orchestrate those things. I think obviously the other thing that sort of the raising money sort of way of growing one of these businesses kind of does is it sort of teaches us, rightly or wrongly, that we should get to this stage of product market fit or whatever we might call it, and then kind of go for growth. Like lean into it, invest in it, sort of you've figured out these channels and this way of growing the business that sort of is economically viable, and now you go and pour as much money on that fire as possible in order to kind of take what would be a 6-year journey of getting to a certain number and do it in 3. How do you think about that? Is that ever a thing that you think, like, if only we had X, like this could be a whatever the number is or whatever the measure is, bigger business? And is that ever a temptation? Because obviously all of these things have been bootstrapped to date. How do you think about that, especially in this sort of fundraising environment?
So I think it's probably where, like, yeah, the VC route and the bootstrapping route really kind of start to divert, because it is massively tempting, like especially kind of 2-3 years in where it's starting to work. The temptation is like, if we had more money to pile into acquisition and development, like would that accelerate it? But then I think we have to go back to what is our model as a venture studio, and it's based on like we aim for 50% net profit for across all ventures. So if we were to forego that profit, then we sort of undermine the whole model, and that doesn't really work for a bootstrapped venture studio. So but that's not a surprising event. Like we know that's the case up front, and so we can sort of engineer our decision making early on to make that not a problem. So it affects how we approach acquisition. Like we try to avoid expensive acquisition channels that get kind of more pricey over time. Invest a lot more in things like content, where you tend to see that sort of kind of exponential result, but not attached to the cost base. So it's things like that where like we can plan in advance to make sure it doesn't kind of come back to bite us later.
I would love if there are any questions. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions if anybody has any. But I think when my kind of final question is, because this is the one thing about, I completely understand the model, and I really respect kind of bootstrap businesses, because it's something that I don't think we would have been able to do, or a business that we would have been able to build. Like one of my things as a founder is like I fell in love with the problem like that we were trying to solve. Like I experienced it myself. I experienced a bunch of people who were also going through the same problem or set of problems. And then I fell in love with the idea of solving the problem. And like that's the thing for me as a person who started the business and is running it like 9 years later. Sunday night, reason I get up on a Monday morning is because I'm still really passionate about this problem that we're solving. How do you kind of engender that like same level of like passion in any one of the companies? And have you ever had a situation where you've really fallen in love with the problem that you're trying to solve, and you kind of question the whole idea of a venture studio, and why aren't we just kind of doing this thing?
Yeah, I mean, I fell in love with the venture process more. Like I naturally like to sort of I think I get bored with things quite quickly. So to sort of change what I'm working on every year seemed like a good fit. So I love the process of creating new ventures and getting them to product market fit. But yeah, probably I'd say not every venture is one that I fell in love with. But there's always aspects of every one that we build. There's something about it. Like we had a really boring like financial comparison site a few years ago, but the SEO side of it was fascinating. And
so you fall in love with the components of the things that you're building as opposed to the thing itself.
I think so, yeah.
I think that's a really interesting way of kind of like framing kind of some of these things. And I also think that I definitely couldn't do what you do, because I get too emotionally attached to these things. And the idea of, I imagine in a kind of venture studio model, there's three ways that these businesses, they either fail, they kind of continue in the background and you figure out how to nurture them over time, or you sell them. And I know you've kind of sold a couple of these kind of businesses as well. Like, is there a process for that, just as there is a process for finding product market fit? Because that's one of when you raise money, like there is an expected outcome at some point, whether it's going public or selling the business or whatever. Like how do you think about that? Like when you move on to the next thing, how do you think about the portfolio of things and what happens with them?
Yeah, so we have kind of rough kind of guidelines. Like we try to so we build a new one every year. We aim to sell one every 3 to 5 years, and then it's all then just a case of percentages. We know like we allocate 20% of like the revenue to R&D for the next venture, and it's all just sort of as much as we can, just trying to kind of take a step back and look at like what's the appropriate percentages for everything to kind of keep kind of ticking over.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you. Cheers.